The separation of powers is one of those very blurry areas that changes over time, and I think that it's still evolving. There are many areas where things seem to have changed completely and be out of sync with the Constitution. For instance, only Congress, according to the Constitution, can declare war. However, it has not done so since World War II. Therefore, I wonder, where do all these people who are veterans of foreign wars come from if there's been no war declared? I understand that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but the fact of the matter is that means that Congress has abdicated, or the presidents have assumed, something that is constitutionally a congressional duty. So I think that accountability and political systems are changing over time, and I think that our system is dynamic and continues to evolve. Whether that's good or bad is a normative judgment. The claims on this slide are essentially true. However, the issue with respect to how much information Congress has and how much they can focus on an individual program or department is extremely limited. And while they do appropriate funds, they appropriate them very generally, and as I've described in previous discussions, there is no one with sort of oversight over the entire budgetary system, and typically individual agencies get money from different committees who really don't know what the other one's doing. So there's a lot more leeway in there than the theory expressed in our text seems to acknowledge. I think that the author's paradox of oversight has become even more pronounced in the current era. When I was still in the federal service, certainly oversight was minimal to non-existent due to the constant furor going on. And now I can only imagine it's being a great deal worse. With so much congressional energy absorbed by the annual budget process and all of the pieces and information that flows in during that, the oversight is simply not something that happens very often unless there is some glaring problem. Those tend to come to attention only when some major disaster, major catastrophe happens, and the solutions that usually get implemented are not infrequently less than optimal. Difficulty with what the author calls fire alarm oversight is that you need to have a fairly serious problem before complaints rise to a level where they draw congressional attention. And many times the situation is misunderstood. For instance, after Hurricane Katrina, the Department of Homeland Security was blamed for what were seen as failures in response. In turn, they looked for an excuse, and Congress discovered that they had many positions that had been authorized but were not filled. DHS seized on that and then created what they call their 90 and 90 program, where they were going to fill 90% of the vacancies in 90 days. For those of you unfamiliar with federal recruitment procedures, that is light speed. Many of us in the senior executive service used the opportunity to get rid of people who were unproductive in our departments. I sent them a budget person who, quote, hated numbers, unquote, and a functionally illiterate policy writer. They all went toddling over there, and DHS was glad to get them because they had to fill those 90% of those vacant positions in 90 days. That was the solution, if you will. So the fire alarm style doesn't really, in my view, happen until there's a major catastrophe, and then the reactions are often not consistent with the need. Major agency charged with investigating fraud, waste, and abuse is the Government Accountability Office, which is an arm of Congress, or a department that works for Congress. But they are very difficult to get engaged in something that is problematic. I had one case where I had referred it, and an investigator was in town, and he was ready to go get warrants to drop in on a grantee, and something happened. The next thing I knew, he was on vacation for 2 weeks, and he was transferred to the Denver office. Clearly, it was a political thing. Somebody got wind of it and put the kibosh on it. But the idea of this system that routinely roots out fraud, waste, and abuse is simply wrong in my experience. Most GAO activity is either initiated by a member of Congress, usually a senior member of one of the committees. They don't really respond very well to low-level people, or as the result of persistent program manager intervention and requests. But again, these things have to be fairly high profile. Committee staff, like the members themselves, are busy doing other things and have lots of other concerns. Gathering performance information is, as I've said earlier, very difficult because the question of what is performance comes up, and that is interpreted by people generally who receive benefits in one form or another from the program. In reality, the authorizing committees are backwaters. I can recall probably 7 or 8 of programs where the authorizing committee simply forgot to act and the programs were not authorized, yet money was appropriated. Our general counsel chief counsel at Commerce, in one case, interpreted the appropriation as our authority to spend. At the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which had a mirror program of the same kind, trade adjustment assistance, the chief counsel there decided that since the program wasn't authorized, they couldn't spend the money, and they returned it to Congress because it was a small pain-in-the-tail program nobody wanted to do. So the authorizing committees are really the backwater, and you get them when you're a junior member and people try to get out as quickly as they can. And the staff is the same way. They want to get onto Ways and Means or someplace else. They really don't want to be there. Author is much more accurate when he talks about appropriations committees. They are very concerned about what it is the money's being used for. And as I said earlier, there are no hard earmarks anymore where the actual statute says give $10 million to Joe. But what happens instead is they have what are called soft earmarks, where some senator or some other high-ranking person will enter notes, or there'll be a budget note, or there'll be a testimony that recommends that indicates their strong support for a specific grant, and they'll give you the numbers right down to the penny that's going to be asked for. So the idea that somehow or another these things are non-political is nuts. I've never had any dealings with the government affairs or government reform committees, so I really can't comment on their activities. Key points here is access to information and the utility of the information or data that they can get. I recall several instances where congressional committees, or in one case GAO auditors, asked for specific information or access to information, and we at Commerce used the excuse that there could be PII that would be revealed inappropriately, blah, 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 and therefore we would be happy to pull samples of the data for their review, and of course we made sure that it was meeting the standards that they were expecting. And then the access to information is one issue, even if they know the information exists, and then they get a great deal of just garbage. When I was doing oversight at a Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission, my rule was if they wanted me to know the answer. They'd give me one-page memo with perhaps one page attached with the appropriate statutory section circled. And if they didn't, they'd give me a banker's box full of stuff, at which time I would start in the middle, because that's generally where the stuff was located. Security clearance and security classification is an issue. Much more common is personally identifiable information or proprietary information. These kinds of things can't be released to the general public, and since you can make the case that the report is public, and or you can have agreements when you give the grants or when you sign the contracts that proprietary information is there and will not be released beyond the department, you then cover yourself prophylactically so that you don't have to release information to Congress or anybody else. Had any personal dealings with executive privilege, but it is something that comes up from time to time when materials from the White House are directly from the White House are requested. During the Obama administration, one of the favorites was the FOIA information, and they simply charged buckets of money for it and delayed responses, etc., to the point where even some of the left-leaning think tanks were complaining. Is the issue I covered before, the PII stuff. Also, there's a question with respect to what's called work product. Much of what I did was then passed through the chief counsel's office. Our offices right next to each other, or not right next, yeah, right next to each other, and we used to go to lunch together maybe once every 2 weeks. And I'd pass things through his office because then it became legal work product and wasn't releasable. Interestingly, you can go on the website at Congress and find out exactly how big the staff is and what they get paid. But they have increased their staff. But the fact of the matter is that most of the people who are on congressional staffs are interested in one of two things. They want to burrow into a civil service job, and or they want to leverage themselves into some administrative position or lobbying position. Several people that I know in Congress had senior staff people who went off to become lobbyists, etc. GAO is an interesting organization. It used to be the Government Accounting Office, and they kept their initials and changed to the Accountability Office because it sounded better. They do some interesting work, and unfortunately, many of their best recommendations and observations are ignored. For instance, GAO issued a report years ago that pointed out there were 60 different programs in various agencies around the federal government doing economic development, and wouldn't it make sense to coordinate, if not consolidate them? That never went anywhere. And because there are just too many political considerations. So they do good work and they have some interesting stuff, but they're not really a controller of much. The low watermark for legislative control is in New York State, where they don't actually have audits done by accountants. The legislatures, and this includes city councils and hamlet, village councils, etc., all the way up to state legislature, do what they call a legislative audit, which is where they look back and say, well, we said we were going to spend money on that. Is that what we did? That's what we did. Okay, good. And they move on. So even in the general case, most of the people in Congress and many of the legislatures are lawyers. Lawyers in the general case are enumerate, so the budgets are completely beyond them. Statistics are completely beyond them. They have absolutely no idea what the hell they're doing. And then there's this question of intrusion in the executive function, which goes back and forth all the time, primarily to waste time. Accountability has become such a buzzword that I've grown tired of listening to it. The idea that somehow or another the individual public administrators, and I don't care if at the city level, a town level, federal level, state level, are accountable to individual citizens is nonsense. The fact of the matter is that at this point, professional public administrators, through their unions, the PACs the unions have, etc., really are driving the bus in lots of ways. So, again, I used this example before in Flint. There were people who were responsible for what happened, right, from the state level DEQ on down, and those people originally were indicted with much fanfare for felony, and quietly all of them were let go with fourth-class misdemeanors, which result in no criminal record, no loss of benefits or pensions, no very small fines, on the order of $10 and $15, no jail time, no nothing. And the citizens of the state of Michigan are picking up the medical bills for those students. So when you ask yourself about accountability, think about reality. I believe that this entire conclusion represents an idealized theoretical construct. It is not the workday reality of public administration. The public employee unions, the public employee union PACs, etc., and the fact that when you are negotiating with public employee unions as an elected official, you are in a unique position. You are negotiating with people who have the ability to remove their boss. That is not true in nonprofit or private sector or any other sector, and is only true in the U.S. in most cases. And so the protections of civil service law and the union contracts, etc., really shield professional public administrators from any real accountability. People do what they will do as they will do it. And it's very, very difficult to get a realistic appraisal of what they're doing and to get them accountable in any meaningful way. All you have to do is look at the pay that, I was in Bellevue a while ago, and they were passing a bond measure, and in that tiny town where Bellevue University is located, they have a schools administrator who gets a $200,000 a year salary. I mean, honest to God, he's running 2 high schools, a few junior high schools. I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. But that kind of thing is common all across the nation. County and city administrators are the same way. The ICMA runs that shop. It is essentially a union. So I think that you talk about ethics in the public service and the idea of the politics administration dichotomy and those other things. I think you need to take a strong look at what is actually going on. Ask yourself, is this what I'm seeing? And then proceed accordingly.